So the first thing I want to do is just introduce myself. I'm Lydia. I'm with the Dicentra Collective, and I'd also like it to be known who the other members of the collective are, so that in case at the end of the event you have questions about what we're doing, about what's going on, you know who a couple of us are at least. Everyone's met Amelia, who introduced the event. We've got Claire over here. Karen's got the funny headphones on in the green shirt. Kevin is in the back of the room, black sweatshirt. Meredith is right in front of him. And yep. So that's us. That's the Dicentra Collective. And we basically started a couple months ago, and really our main focus was creating communities of care. So we're interested in looking at the micro aspects of care, which is like communication between two people, and then we're interested in looking at the macro aspect, which is taking care of entire communities. So this event tonight is going to be a little bit different than the past event we had and some of our future events. Usually what we're trying to do is we're trying to do some personal stories, and then we're going to, from personal stories, we go a little bit more macro and talk about some of the societal concerns around things. And then we do a workshop so that at the end of every event you guys can take home information to use in everyday life or just to use in the work that you do. Tonight is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to incorporate the workshop part into the Q&A if we can. And this is mostly for time concerns, but also because harm reduction is a little bit nebulous and that you can't necessarily train someone, here's how you communicate in a harm reduction style A, B, C. We're hoping that you'll get some examples and kind of learn how to incorporate that stuff. So I hope that works for everyone, and please feel free to ask questions during the Q&A about how you can incorporate harm reduction into the work that you're doing or into your everyday life. Next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about harm reduction and what that is, so that we all start out on basically the same page. Harm reduction, a lot of times I think, if you type in harm reduction into Google search or something, the primary thing that's going to come up is needle exchange. So a lot of times you say harm reduction and people automatically think, oh, that's a needle exchange program. Okay, cool. But what we want to really emphasize tonight is that harm reduction is actually so much more than that. It's this whole social justice movement. It's global, and it's looking at basically any activity and intervening in that activity to make it less harmful in communities. And we're assuming here that this is activity that's not necessarily the healthiest activity. So I shouldn't have said all activity, but activity that's not necessarily the most helpful. A lot of times people talk about harm reduction specific to public health policy, and we, with the Dicentra Collective, think that that's a really, really important aspect. But again, we want to try to sort of broaden what people's thoughts on harm reduction are, so that we're not just thinking about it as public health. I want to do a couple examples of harm reduction so that everyone has, again, so that we're all kind of on the same page about where we're coming from. I think harm reduction is really great because it can be this like tiny process in communication, and it can also be this huge thing. So one example of micro harm reduction that happened in my life a couple weeks ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I'm a herbal healthcare practitioner. I'm also an OHSU student. And this friend was also an herbal healthcare practitioner, and I was super stressed out, and I was saying like, oh, Rach, I'm having a really, really hard time. I even started smoking cigarettes again. Don't tell anyone that I'm smoking cigarettes. And Rachel was like, oh, Liz, you know, smoking cigarettes, okay. But she never once said, that's not good. She never made a moralistic judgment. She never was like, I can't believe that you've been smoking cigarettes. You know better, right? All she said was, hey, Liz, why? What are the cigarettes doing for you? And I had to like take a second and say, okay, well, let's see, what are they doing for me? So that was the first thing she did that was like essentially harm reduction. She's finding out why the behavior is happening in the first place. The next thing she said was, okay, well, how many cigarettes are you smoking a day? And I was like, oh, I'm smoking like 3 a day, maybe 5 a day. She's like, okay, so let's cut it down to 1. And she didn't push at all to totally stop smoking. She just said, hey, let's do 1 cigarette a day. Call me in a couple days and tell me if that's working for you. And I did, and it worked. Of course, now I've been having like 2 or 3 cigarettes a day again. But for like a week, I was back to 1 cigarette a day, which was great. So that's kind of like the most micro, like that's a really, really micro example of harm reduction. And then we have sort of the more general harm reduction, which is needle exchange, passing out condoms in high schools, kind of the things that people talk about as being harm reduction. My favorite example of like the big macro harm reduction is looking at soldiers in World War I and World War II. And I really love it because it's like Republicans don't get to own all historical war stories. Like we get to talk about this stuff too, right? In World War I, it was just mandated that soldiers, that American soldiers overseas just didn't engage in sexual activity, period. But what happened was, after World War I, we had all of these soldiers come back to American soil, American wives, and the rate of venereal disease, the term at the time, skyrocketed. So World War II rolls around, and they actually start passing out condoms to soldiers, 8 condoms a soldier for every month. And lo and behold, what do you know, soldiers came back, and the rate of venereal disease didn't increase dramatically as it did after World War I. So that's just like this example that I love, because if people critique harm reduction, you can throw it out and be like, look, it doesn't actually work. Like, you can mandate that people don't do these behaviors, but what you'll find is that it really doesn't pan out. So by now, I'm thinking that you guys might be wondering how this is connected to creating communities of care, and specifically how it's connected to the talk that we had last month about chronic pain. And it's a little bit of a hard conversation for me to have, because to me it seems so obvious. If we're going to create communities of care, we want to look both, and I feel like I keep saying this, but we want to look both at the micro, like the tiniest piece of human connection and human communication, but we also want to be taking care of communities as a whole. So because of that, we need personal stories. And I'm hoping that tonight people will share some stories about harm reduction in their life, as I showed the fact that I've been smoking recently. Again, please don't share anyone outside of this room that I've been smoking. So we need those personal stories, and we need stories of struggle, but we also need theories that kind of backs the work and fuels the work that we're doing as we go out into the community and attempt to create some kind of change. So I'm hoping that what you will take away from tonight's event is 2 things. I'm hoping that first you'll have an idea of how to incorporate harm reduction into the work that you're doing, or just into everyday life. And also that you have an understanding of harm reduction that's not just that harm reduction is needle exchange. I want you to see harm reduction as something that's much broader and can be applied many more places. So on that note, I want to pass it off to Dennis, who is the director of Janus Youth Yellow Brick Road program. Is that?
All the outreach program.
All the outreach program, okay. Okay, so this is Dennis Lundberg, and he's going to talk about how harm reduction fuels his work with homeless youth.
Thanks. First of all,